Good evening. My name is Shushmita Mandal. On behalf of the German Consulate in Kolkata, I welcome you all to the second web-based science lectures of ours. These lectures aim to further strengthen the cooperation and collaboration between Germany and India on science and research. This is a platform for German and Indian scientists to share their latest research findings with other scientists, academicians, and any other interested individuals. Today's science lectures will be on surface tension from fascinating physics to future technologies. There will be two parts. The first lecture, some intriguing effects related to surface tension, will be by Professor Steffen Hardt of TU Darmstadt. And the second part, harnessing wettability engineering for future technologies, will be by Professor Ranjan Ganguly of Jadavpur University. Before I hand over to the moderator of this session, Professor Amitabh Datta, from the Department of Power Engineering, Jadavpur University, and a former Alexander von Humboldt Fellow, I'd like to mention some updates on the Indo-German Partnership Higher Education Program, that is IGP. After the successful completion of its first phase, that is 2016 to 2020, the Indo-German Partnership in Higher Education Program has been extended for another 4 years. In this phase 2, India and Germany each will invest 3.5 million euros. 9 projects of 8 Indian institutions will receive funding in this second phase, that is during 2020 to 2024. These Indian institutions are Indian Institute of Science, Bengaluru, IIT Delhi, National Law School of India University, Bangalore, IIT Bombay, IIT Roorkee, Anna University, Chennai, Malovia National Institute of Technology, Jaipur, and NIT Rourkela. Let me now hand over to the moderator, Professor Amitabh Datta. Amitabh Datta, please.
Sound.
You are still muted.
Thank you, Shushmita. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to act as moderator in today's event of Science Lecture Series. Good evening to all of you. As the moderator of the session, I welcome you all in the program today. The topic of the day has already been said, surface tension from fascinating physics to future technologies. Now, surface tension is a property of the fluid due to the intermolecular attraction at the interface. When a liquid, say water, is in contact with, say, air, then the surface tension property acts at the interface, and the interface behaves like a stretched membrane, just like the surface of a balloon. This gives rise to various characteristic shapes and patterns to the fluid. For example, you see beads on the lotus leaves. We all know that human cannot walk on water, but due to the surface tension property of water, some of the insects can walk on water. So that is the beauty of this property. Surface tension also gives rise to the capillary effect, as a result of which, when you dip a narrow glass tube in a pool of water, water rises up through the tube, and it rises up to a level which is above the free surface level of the surface tension. Also has other fascinating behavior. For example, when you spray a liquid through a nozzle, the liquid comes out and breaks down into small droplets. The fineness of the droplets depends on the surface tension property of the liquid through a non-dimensional number called Weber number. So it plays a determining role in determining the size of the respiratory droplets in air, on which we are so much very worried today under the COVID situation. My friend and colleague Ranjan is doing a lot of fascinating work with this property. Sometimes he calls me in his lab to show the work of his group, and I just look in wonder what they're doing. Professor Hardt is he's a globally recognized expert in the field. He was also the host of Ranjan when he visited Germany with the Humboldt Fellowship. I'm very happy that both of them will illuminate us with the fascinating property of this fluid. I'm sure you will experience wonderful scientific things in the next 1 hour or so from their lecture, and this will raise a lot of questions in your mind. But I request you to be very short and precise with your questions. And that will help us to take as many questions as possible within the stipulated time of ours. You please do not ask question at the end of the first talk. We will take the questions after we finish both the talks. So you can please write down the questions in the chat box, which is there on the right of your screen, and I will take the questions in sequence. It will be good for me if you please write down the name of the speaker to whom you want to address your question. That will help my work. I will also request all of you to kindly mute yourselves during the talk so that there is no noise disruption. With these few words, we will now directly go to the event of the day. I will first take the task of introducing the honorable speakers to you. First, Professor Steffen Hardt. Okay, so I will go to this. Yes. Hope you can see it. Yes. So Professor Hardt is the head of the Institute for Nano and Microfluidics at TU Darmstadt, Germany. He received his PhD in theoretical physics, after which he accepted the position at Institute for Microtechnik Mainz, where the focus of his research shifted to microtechnology and microfluidics, which is the call of the day today. Professor Hardt has extensively worked on fundamental aspects of micro and nanofluidics. In fact, some of our students from our department also worked under him in his lab, and we are thankful to him to give our students that opportunity. His current research interests include electrokinetic flow and transport, interfacial flow, weighting phenomena, nanoscale gas kinetics, and separation and manipulation of biomolecule. Professor Hardt has a number of important publications in the best of the journals. So with these few words, I will hand over the mic to Professor Hardt for his talk.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me to give one of the science lectures. I start right away with my presentation, which is basically on fundamental aspects of surface tension. So let me do that now. Okay. You should be able to see my presentation now. Is that visible?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Very good. So I will start right away. So basically, this is part one of the presentation, which is more about fundamentals. So basically, it's entitled Intriguing Effects Related to the Surface Tension. Hopefully, these effects are intriguing. And I will start just by basically give you some fundamentals about the physics of surface tension. So actually, what is the physical origin of surface tension? Imagine you have an interface between a liquid and a gas. So on a molecular scale, this looks like that. And as you all know, or most of you know, basically, there are force fields between the molecules. So on average, these forces are attractive. So they are actually denoted by these blue arrows here. And so basically, how does surface tension come about on a molecular level? So imagine you are a molecule, or a molecule is sitting here basically in the bulk of the liquid. This has a number of interaction partners. It has attractive interactions with these interaction partners, and compare that to a molecule that is sitting at the surface, this has less interaction, so less attractive interactions with molecules, but just because it has less neighbors. It's sitting at the surface, therefore it has less neighbors, which means you need to invest potential energy to bring a molecule from the bulk of the liquid to the surface. So a molecule at the surface has a higher potential energy compared to a molecule in the bulk here. And this is basically the origin of surface tension. So it basically costs energy to create surface of a liquid, and the units of surface tension are therefore energy per area. It's just a direct measure of the energy it costs you to create new surface area, for example, by deforming a small droplet or something like that. So I will not have a lot of mathematical equations. I think this is the only mathematical equation, but this is a very fundamental equation about the action of surface tension in a liquid. So this is the well-known Young-Laplace equation, more than 200 years old. And this relates actually the pressure inside a liquid. So this is, let's say, a liquid ring in a capillary. Imagine this is a circular capillary. This is the symmetry axis here. There's a liquid ring in this capillary. I mean, liquid volumes like that actually exist. So the surface of the liquid would look like that. We computed that analytically. And the pressure inside the liquid, right below the gas-liquid interface, is different from the pressure in the gas by this amount. I mean, this is what the Young-Laplace equation tells you. No, I mean, for the moment, forget about this last equation sign here. So this is like, if you look at the two first equation, or equal signs, basically, then this is the general form of the Young-Laplace equation. And this relates the pressure jump across an interface. So there's a pressure jump when you, let's say, go from the gas here to the liquid. Two things. I mean, first of all, there's the surface tension here. And then there are two inverse radii of curvature here. And together, this is the mean surface curvature. These two radii of curvature are just basically the radii of curvature of this surface here, of the liquid surface, in two different directions. So one can be concave and one can be convex. I mean, in the general sense, this can happen. So basically, they can have different signs. You can have a mean curvature that is 0. Well, if you have 0 gravity, imagine that you switch off gravity in outer space or something like that, then basically this last equal sign kicks in. This means that this quantity here, which is a measure of the surface curvature, needs to be constant. And this is actually an equation defining the geometry of that surface. That's a mathematical equation you can use to compute the geometry of the surface. I mean, shapes like that, for example. It applies to liquids at rest. So, I mean, if you look at that last equal sign here, it basically applies to liquids at rest. Basically, if you solve that equation with this last sign here, this means that the mean curvature of the surface needs to be the same everywhere. And you call these surfaces with constant mean curvature minimal surfaces. And also interestingly, these solutions actually correspond to configurations of minimal potential energy. So basically, a droplet or another surface takes a shape of minimum potential energy. It's not quite right because there can be unstable solution. It's only for unstable solutions, it's only stationary potential energy. But the most relevant solution are, of course, stable solutions that correspond to minimal potential energy. So the surface configures itself in such a way that the energy is minimal, but under certain constraints. For example, certain contact angles here at the solid surface. When you solve this equation, for example, analytically, or in most cases analytically, you can basically find two types of solutions, stable or unstable solutions. So unstable solutions are solutions of this equation. You can get funny shapes out of that. I will show you some funny shapes, but they usually do not correspond to physically meaningful scenarios. Because, I mean, if you just perturb these unstable surfaces a little bit, they will collapse. They will transform into something else. But nevertheless, I mean, these surfaces, they look sometimes aesthetically pleasing. So, for example, there are these Lawson surfaces, a special type of unstable minimal surfaces. I'm not an expert on these. I just wanted to show you these pictures. as examples of minimal surfaces, unstable minimal surfaces. I mean, they may be of interest to mathematicians. Maybe if you're an engineer or a physicist, they are not so interesting to you because they are unstable. You don't find them in nature, but they look interesting. And I mean, this mathematician with the name Lawson, he came up with a method to also compute these unstable surfaces, which is not easy because they are unstable. But this is not my main point. Let's maybe talk about practical implications of surface tension. And I mean, this was already alluded to. Practical applications of surface tensions play a role for animals, for example. So everybody of you probably knows these little animals called water striders. They are able to walk on water, and they are able to walk on water because of surface tension. So basically surface tensions or surface tension keeps them floating. If there was no surface tension, they would basically sink. But I mean, fortunately, water has a quite large surface tension, so they can walk on water. And the basic physics of that is not too complicated. It's actually a part of my lecture. So you can analyze, for example, a body of a certain shape. So this is actually a 2D situation. So that would correspond to a cylinder, a solid cylinder floating on a liquid surface. And you can analyze that situation and you can come up with an equation telling you what, let's say, the maximum density or the maximum weight of that cylinder is, so that the cylinder can still float. So this is, I'm not going to go into details here. This is basically a balance of 3 different forces. So this is the gravitational force pulling this cylinder down. Then there's a buoyancy force. So basically every body that you immerse in a liquid experiences a buoyancy force. This is force number 2. And force number 3, I mean, this is the main force here. This is the surface tension force. So basically it acts along the gas-liquid interface here. So basically it's a force pulling along this line which is now tangential to the gas-liquid interface. And because of the normal component in y direction here of this force, this body can float. So this is actually what the water strider makes use of. But the water strider, if you look at his legs more closely, I mean, he's a little bit more tricky than what that simple physics suggests. I mean, let's take a look at the legs of such a water strider. If you look at the legs of a water strider in a microscope, you can see these microstructures here. So this is actually a microscopic view of these legs here. And if you look at the legs in an electron microscope, you see that these hairs are really thin, like a few micrometers thick. So why does that water strider have these hairy legs? So, I mean, first of all, in quite general terms, for small animals and for insects especially, it's really important to keep dry. I mean, if they are basically immersed in water, and they can easily get immersed in water because of surface tension forces, they can get sucked into a droplet, for example, then this can be fatal to small animals. So, I mean, establishing mechanisms by millions of years of evolution to keep dry is really important for them. So, well, quite recently, 5 years ago, there was a very nice publication on basically surface tension effects related to the legs of that water strider. So what these authors did is they took microscopic images of water condensation on the hairs of legs of water striders. So I play that video to you now, and what you basically see is, I mean, there's humid air, and from humid air, you see condensation of water droplets. So basically what you will see now, first, there's condensation at the tips of these small hairs, and then also because of surface tension forces, these drops get pulled down to the base of these hairs, but then you see something amazing. So let's play that video. So condensation, these small drops get pulled down, but then you see these larger drops. So basically these drops grow and grow, and these larger drops get expelled from the forest of hairs. So let's play that again. Small drops condensing, and they grow to be larger drops, and then they get expelled from the forest of hairs. Why is that? What is the physical mechanism behind that? So you can explain the physics of that in such a way. There are some drops, and this is a droplet that already gets expelled. It basically comes from the base of these hairs. So when this droplet grows because of condensation, it accumulates more and more water. Then basically the growing droplet it would actually displace these hairs, and when these hairs get pushed away, when they get displaced, they form these conical structures, these conical bundles of hairs here. And when you now imagine that there is a droplet sitting in, well, between such conical structures, such conical bundles, and there's a surface tension force pushing that droplet out here, because the curvature here on this side is larger than the curvature on this side. And remember, the Young-Laplace equation tells you then that because the curvature is larger here, which means the radius of curvature is smaller here compared to there, the pressure here is higher. So the droplet is going to be pushed out. And this is what, of course, a water strider likes, because a water strider wants to keep dry. Okay, so that's actually one of many, many examples of natural or surfaces that occur in nature that have interesting wetting properties. So definitely the most famous example for these nature-inspired surfaces, or surfaces you can find in nature, actually is the surface of a lotus leaf. If you look at a lotus leaf in a microscope, you find these macrostructures on the surface. So you find these bumps there. But if you look more closely, so this is actually one bump here. If you look more closely, you see there are nanostructures on the surface of that bump. So it's actually a multi-scale structure. So microstructures covered with nanostructures. And as a result, I mean, you all know that, the lotus leaf is really good at making water droplets roll off from its surface. So droplets roll off really easily. This is, of course, biologically beneficial if these leaves don't get wet. And this is actually found for many, many other types of leaves. So, I mean, the lotus leaf is a particularly nice example, but it's found for many other types of leaves as well. So, well, this headline tells you nature-inspired surfaces. So what does it mean? So basically, around 30 years ago, scientists and engineers thought, okay, why not copy this? I mean, why not copy these lotus leaf surfaces? And what you can do, of course, you can microfabricate a surface. There are different types of surfaces. That surface has an array of pillars, an array of posts here, something similar to the surface of a lotus leaf. Then you can put a droplet on top. You need to make sure that the material here, or at least the surface here, is sufficiently hydrophobic. And then if you gently place a surface or a droplet on that surface, you will see that it rolls off. It will roll off because it actually doesn't intrude into the interstitials between these posts here. These interstitials between the posts are still filled with gas. And this is what I call, or not what only I call, but what scientists call a Cassie state. But if you actually force a droplet too hard, if you, let's say, push it too hard to the surface, you will see that these cavities here collapse and the gas is pushed out. And also this liquid here will wet the floors of these cavities. And then this is called the Wenzel state. And the Wenzel state is something usually you want to avoid, because in the Wenzel state, the droplet doesn't roll off very easily. So what you usually want to have in conjunction with these so-called engineered superhydrophobic surfaces is a droplet in the Cassie state, but only in the Cassie state, or because only in the Cassie state, it easily rolls off from the surface. And this actually couples to very recent research we did in our lab. So we actually looked at multi-scale surfaces, and I'll show you a video we recently produced here. So this is a cooperation with my cooperation partner, Moran Berkovic, at the Israel Institute of Technology, the so-called Technion in Haifa. And this is a paper we published really recently in Langmuir. It's about wetting on hierarchical superhydrophobic surfaces. Let me play the video for you. So what you see now is we have, I mean, you hear some nice music, and we have a micropillared surface, and we decorate that micropillared surface with nanoparticles. So we have a hierarchical structure. So you see a scanning electron microscopy image here. You see these nanostructures here. And then we see what happens if we push that gas-liquid interface down. We use electric forces. For that case, it doesn't matter what type of force you use. You can use mechanical forces. We use electric forces. And if you use electric forces, you can induce that so-called Cassie to Wenzel transition. This is a surface without nanoparticles. And what you see here is the transition to a Wenzel state, darkest Wenzel state. It occurs rapidly and everywhere. Now compare it to the structure. I mean, the transition is totally different. It occurs locally. And the most interesting thing is you can reverse it. At least you can partially reverse it. You basically switch off the voltage, and then you see it goes back to the original state, which is really beneficial. So for the undecorated surface without nanoparticles, this wouldn't happen. So these surfaces are much more robust, which means that if you want to have a surface that is mechanically stable with respect to this Cassie to Wenzel wetting transition, then you better decorate it with nanoparticles. You have a hierarchical surface, which is reversible, as you can see here in this example. And this is what you need if you want to, I mean, the Cassie state is what you need if you want to make a droplet roll-off easily. So this has been published in Langmuir quite recently. So if you want to read the paper, of course, I would be happy about that. But this doesn't solve all problems, of course. If you want to render a surface mechanically stable with respect to this Cassie to Wenzel transition, again, I remind you, you want to avoid the Wenzel state. Usually, I mean, what you can do, you can employ nanostructures. In our case, it was micropillars decorated with nanoparticles, but you can nanostructure a surface right away. So you can look at a surface that consists of nanopillars, just shown in that image. And then basically you can look at the failure modes of that surface. So again, I remind you, you want to use or you want to avoid wetting of the interstitials here. But there's a different mechanism that can induce wetting of the interstitials here. This different mechanism is condensation. So imagine you bring a warm or a hot droplet onto that surface. So there's a temperature gradient, a temperature difference between the liquid here and the surface. Or you can also imagine that you cool your surface. I mean, you have a droplet at room temperature and you cool your surface. So what will happen then? So this is a diagram I basically borrowed from this recent Nature Materials paper here. So this axis shows temperature difference between the droplet and the surface, and this shows time. So actually, no matter what the temperature difference is, you will first see nucleations of droplets, of very small droplets in the interstitials here. And then basically you flood the almost entire space, in that case, the entire space between the pillars. And this is what you want to avoid, because you always want to avoid liquid filling the interstitials between these pillars here. So what can you do about that? I mean, how can you avoid that? So we remember what the water strider did. I mean, the water strider had these hairs on his legs, and these hairs, they could form conical structures. So imagine now you have a surface like that. So it's no longer a surface like that, but you have a surface with conical nanostructures. So in a similar way as for the water strider, what we would expect is that a droplet can be expelled from the interstitials here because of surface tension forces, because you build up a high pressure here. This will expel droplets from the surface. And now you can do that test. You can do an experiment where you basically compare this surface here, this is surface A, to surface B, and you do an experiment where you let liquid condense on the surface. So you can imagine you have a droplet at room temperature and you cool down the surface, and then you see what happens. So surface A is the normal nanopillars, and these are the cones. You see distinct differences between these two images. I mean, the most distinct difference, if we let this video play for a little bit longer, you don't develop larger droplets here. So basically, when these droplets have reached a certain size, they become expelled from the conical nanostructures just because of this effect. And here, where you don't have conical nanostructures, you see that droplets can grow to a very large size. So if you want to keep a surface dry, just like, I mean, the surface of the legs of a water strider, it's a good idea to have, in a way, conical nanostructures. In the case of the water strider, basically these conical nanostructures are formed, or microstructures are formed dynamically. Okay, so I think that's quite intriguing. So far, I have more or less assumed that I have a single component liquid. So I haven't talked about liquid mixtures or something like that. Now let's look at what can happen in terms of surface tension if you have a liquid mixture. So you have a container filled with a mixture of liquid, and it's not really mixed. So basically you have one type of liquid here or one component here and the other component there. And let's imagine that these two different liquids, I mean, it could be alcohol and water, for example, have different surface tension. So when we look at a point at the liquid surface, you can imagine that the surface tension pulls on that point. So this is the point we consider now. There's a large pull to the right here because of high surface tension, and there's a small pull to the left, which means that there's a net force on this point, and this net force will actually displace liquid. It will induce a liquid flow, and that liquid flow is called Marangoni convection, and it's really observed. So basically, the liquid will go to the regions of higher surface tension, and it's well known that you can do that basically in two different ways. You can have this Marangoni effects based on concentration gradients. This is what I show you here, but also temperature gradients work as well. And this is related to an effect that some of you have probably observed. I mean, for those of you who enjoy alcoholic beverages, you have perhaps recognized this tears of wine effect. So when you have an alcoholic beverage, alcohol content maybe between 15 and 20% or something like that, which is close to the optimal alcohol content. And you can sometimes observe such an effect here. So you have a glass with an alcoholic beverage, and you somehow wet the walls of that glass, and then you observe that there are some tears running down. And these tears are tears of wine, and they are caused actually by the Marangoni stresses, by the Marangoni convection effect. What is the physical explanation of that? The physical explanation of that goes like that. So first of all, the wall is wetted here. There's preferential evaporation of the liquid mixture here close to the three-phase contact line. And because if you have, let's say, an alcohol-water mixture, because alcohol evaporates more easily than water, you get enrichment of water here. So basically, you have a higher concentration of water here close to the three-phase contact line compared to the bulk. This induces a pull. So pull just, I mean, on the slide I had before, just basically the same mechanism. So liquid is being pulled up. And when liquid is pulled up continuously, then it forms these bulges. And then the liquid remembers that there's actually gravity. And then gravity pulls these tears down. So it pulls liquids down, and this appears as tears. This is called the tears of wine effect. This is an effect that is caused by Marangoni convection, Marangoni stresses. What we did in our lab, we looked at this tears of wine effect under confinement. So just, I mean, when I go back here, imagine that you shrink the diameter of this glass to 1 millimeter. So we wanted to see what happens then. This is our glass here, and to make this effect more pronounced, we have a mixture, alcohol and water here in some pool. We dip a capillary inner diameter around 1 millimeter, sometimes a little bit smaller than 1 millimeter. We dip it into the mixture, and we have a heating block here, ramping the temperature up to 80-something degrees here. So basically, there's uniform temperature here. And then we observe really funny phenomena. We observe, in some cases, we observe liquid rings here, similar to the liquid ring you saw on my second slide. And sometimes we observe liquid plugs. So we sometimes see that a liquid ring transforms into a liquid plug. So let me go into some more details. So this is actually the shape of a liquid ring in the capillary we computed. So basically, this is the axis of the capillary. So it's just a cylindrical tube. And these different blue lines correspond to the liquid ring containing different volumes of liquid. So, for example, this line is the smallest volume, and this line is the biggest volume. So as Marangoni convection pulls up more and more liquid, this liquid ring will grow. And what happens then, finally, I will show you in this video. So this is a liquid ring here. You see the liquid ring here. The meniscus is oscillating a bit here. And then suddenly you see that this liquid ring collapses and moves up. It collapses. I mean, we have really analyzed it, I think, quite deeply. It collapses because the solution of the Young-Laplace equation has a stability limit. It becomes unstable when a certain volume is exceeded. And I mean, you can see if you look at the whole capillary there, you can see quite funny effects. It's a little bit difficult to see because, I mean, in this overall scheme or overall view, these liquid rings, oh, sorry about that, these liquid rings are really tiny, but let's play that video. So you see one liquid ring here, one liquid ring there, and then you will see that these liquid rings transform into plugs. These plugs move up. They move up because of evaporation, because there's gas or vapor generated here. And this pushes these rings out. So tears of wine under confinement is a completely different effect compared to the usual tears of wine in a really macroscopic glass. So this is also published, recent work we published in Journal of Fluid Mechanics this year. And this already brings me to my conclusions and to my outlook. So, I mean, this, as you can see, what I put up here is quite general conclusions. I mean, surface tension is ubiquitous in nature, but not only in nature, also in industrial processes and also in future industrial applications. And Ranjan Ganguly will tell you more about that, why surface tension is an effect we can really exploit there. But also in terms of science, I mean, if you look at the history of science, many important scientific developments are in some way related to surface tension. And this is, I mean, you would expect that if you look back to the Young-Laplace equation, it's 200 years old, you would expect maybe that this is a sort of, well, old-fashioned research area. It's not, it's really not, because, I mean, a large number of interesting results and developments date back to the past few decades. There are also a lot of open scientific questions in which surface tension plays a role, also in our lab. I mean, for example, what I showed you, tears of wine under confinement, this is something we discovered quite recently. I think nobody knew about that before. So if you want to enter this research area, I think it's still a modern research field, even if the foundations are already 200 years old or something like that. And it relates to applications. So basically, I think a better understanding of surface tension related phenomena is key to a number of emerging technologies. So we're not speaking about established technologies, but emerging technologies. And this will be conveyed to you by Professor Ranjan Ganguly in part 2 of this presentations. So this means that I'm done with my presentation. And thank you very much for your attention. And I will basically then hand over by ending my presentation. Thanks a lot.
So thank you, Steffen, for the nice presentation. You have shown some of the beautiful phenomena that happens in nature, like why the beads form on the lotus drop, and how these water spiders, they move on water, they walk on water. And you have also shown the importance of the structure of the, surface structure, presence of nanostructure on microstructure. So these are very interesting. We will come with the questions to you after we finish the second talk. Let us then move to the second talk. Our second speaker is Professor Ranjan Ganguly. I will give us brief introduction of Ranjan now. Okay, so can you see?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can see.
Okay, so Professor Ranjan Ganguly is a professor in the Power Engineering Department of Jadavpur University, my department, and he is an adjunct professor at the Mechanical and Industrial Engineering Department of University of Illinois at Chicago as well. He received his PhD from UIC, and he also visited University at Hanover, TU Darmstadt, and Virginia Tech for his research. He is a former Alexander von Humboldt Fellow and a Fellow of West Bengal Academy of Science and Technology. Professor Ganguly has received other accolades like Dean Scholar Award at UIC, INA Young Engineer Award, and Outstanding Alumni Award of our Department of Power Engineering. His research encompasses wettability engineering, microfluidics, heat transfer, and energy systems. Professor Ganguly has several international publications and a few patents and invention disclosures to his credit. I will now hand over to Ranjan for his talk.
Thank you, Professor Dattu, for the kind introduction. Let me share my screen. I hope you can see it. And thank you, Steffen, for this wonderful introduction about this fascinating science. And first of all, let me thank the German Consulate in Kolkata for giving me an opportunity to speak on this topic in front of an august gathering. Good evening, everybody. And it's a real pleasure for me to share some of the some nice or rather interesting applications of one of the finest physical phenomena that we can see under the sun. So we will. What I'll try to take you through is some interesting application that can be useful for the mankind. Some useful applications of this surface tension. Now, one of the basic necessity that we are now experiencing in this present context is healthcare. And if we look at the general scenario of the global healthcare, just maybe 6 months back, there were fantastic feats that we have seen over the past 10 years or so, like starting from telemedicine, surgical robotic surgery. There are great advancements in genomics. People have developed body sensors, wearable sensors. The 3D printing has been able to produce organs or even powered exoskeletons. While all these are so fascinatingly true, there is also a grim side. These data are kind of dated, but the figures have not changed much since 2006. Nearly 50% of the population, they do not have basic sanitation globally. 33% do not have access to electricity. 18% lacks the basic healthcare services and clean drinking water. And I mean, the most unfortunate thing is that the more than 50% of the death in the poorest countries are results of some infectious diseases that are listed here. And to add to that, we are now, the entire world has been brought down to its knees with this pandemic of COVID-19. With almost 24 million infection and nearly 1 million death, now we are struggling to strike a balance between human survival and the survival of the economy. And one tool that has come up or being projected as a prospective candidate to bridge the two gap, or rather balance the two, is a rapid detection kit. And such a detection kit actually, it's essentially pivots on a technology which is known as point of care diagnostic, or POC we call it, and a low cost POC for this large population to be catered. So this virus is, we probably by now we are all almost expert through WhatsApp and Google about this virus. And we already probably know, most of us, what this immunoassay is. This immunoassay are essentially a chemical protocol where we leverage the binding between the antigen and antibody. And this rapid antibody diagnosis kit, it essentially relies on the fact that in blood, upon infection, there are two types of antibodies, immunoglobulin G and immunoglobulin M, which are present. And this presence of this IgG and IgM varies with time, depending upon the time, or rather the occurrence of the infection, or the duration of the time period from the first occurrence of infection or the symptoms. Essentially, these immunoassays are converted to rapidly on a POC device through lateral flow immunoassays. On your top right, you see the basic configuration of such a commonly available lateral flow immunoassay, where you deposit a drop of blood and then after finger prick, you deposit a drop of blood, and then you add a buffer in a well in that same device, and the liquid, it permeates through a porous medium, and then after some time, it gives some indication line in the form of lines, which tells you whether there is an infection or not. On your top left, what you see is a blown up diagram where actually the blood and the buffer is allowed to permeate through a porous membrane structure. There is a conjugation pad where in case of COVID or SARS-CoV-2 virus detection, or rather not the virus detection, the antibody detection, this pad is already pre-impregnated with COVID-19 antigen, which are conjugated with gold nanoparticles. And if the blood has antibodies, the COVID-19 IgG and IgM antibody, they would bind onto these antigens and will tether alongside these gold nanoparticles. And down the line, on the detection lines, there are other anti-human antibodies which are actually deposited or decorated, which, if the antibody, the COVID antibody was present in the blood, will tether the entire conjugate onto them. If the antibody was not present in the blood, they wouldn't tether these gold nanoparticles. So the basic principle relies on the fact that the liquid has to be transported through capillary action across this membrane. So it relies on the capillary imbibition. We all know that these diagnostic kits have their own issues. Well, of course, the selectivity and specificities are still debated, and that's why we take these results with a pinch of salt. And also the speed, which can always be improved. So we need faster transport and better specificity and selectivity of these devices. And for better specificity and selectivity, what you can do is you can either multiplex these tests. So for example, instead of one droplet feeding to one detection channel, if you can do multiple detections, which allows you to do repeat tests simultaneously or test for multiple strains, you can reduce the false negative and false positive cases. In order to reduce the erroneous reading, you also need sometimes to mask out other competing molecules. For that, you need pre-treatment of the blood sample, which needs merging and mixing of liquids. And sometimes precise metered dispensing of the liquid on the chip also leads to, or rather a lack of that leads to an error in reading. So if suppose a lateral immunoassay like that, an open strip of porous material, if we can impart all these features on such a low-cost device, that gives us a hope that we will get a better or more accurate reading and faster reading. So that's why we are now basically looking towards wettability to help us in this situation. Of course, Steffen gave a brief overview, so I'll quickly glance through this. Steffen talked about surface tension, and when a liquid droplet is interacting with a solid surface, essentially the liquid, solid, and the gas, they meet at a particular point, not a point, a line, and this is known as the three-phase contact lines. And at those contact lines, you have forces arising because of the surface energy per unit area of the solid and the liquid in presence of the gas. So if we take a corner point on the triple line, what we'll see is that there is a tussle between the forces due to the surface tension occurring between the solid and the gas, liquid and the gas, and the solid and the liquid. And when we balance these components of the in-plane components of these forces, we get the well-known Young equation, which actually relates geometrically the contact angle, the angle that the liquid subtends on the surface with the surface tension of the solid with respect to the gas, solid with respect to the liquid, and the surface tension of the liquid in presence of the gas. this denominator is more commonly known as the surface tension of the liquid. So what it tells us that the signature of these surface energies per unit area are actually reflected through the contact angle. Also, Steffen talked about the Laplace pressure. So if we have a droplet sitting on a surface under a curved surface, we have a pressure jump or a pressure buildup. And a simple calculation shows that this extra pressure or additional pressure can be represented for a hemispherical cap, can be represented in terms of the surface tension of the liquid and the radius of curvature. And it clearly means that smaller is the radius of curvature, higher is the Laplace pressure that is developed, the extra pressure developed inside this liquid droplet. So smaller the better, stronger. I just mentioned it because I will, in the later course of my lecture, we'll see how it's leveraged. Now, depending upon this mutual surface energy of the liquids and the solid in presence of the gas, the contact angle can be varied. For example, you get surfaces where the contact angle is very small, meaning that the liquid almost spreads instantly on the surface. We call them superhydrophilic. Surfaces where the liquid sustains an angle less than 90 degrees, we call it hydrophilic. Surfaces are there which we call hydrophobic, where the contact angle is greater than 90. And there are surfaces where the contact angle is very high, greater than 150 degrees, we call them superhydrophobic. And nature has abundantly given us examples of these surfaces. Lotus leaf is one such example of superhydrophobic surface. Also, the contact angle definitely depends on the surface tension of the liquid. For example, in image A, you see water sprayed on a leaf, but the water was surfacted because there was insecticide sprayed, and for these insecticide sprays, you want a tiniest droplet to spread over the entire leaf to the largest extent possible. So what people do, the insecticides are developed. There are surfactants which are mixed with the insecticides so that whenever you spray it on leaves, they spread almost uniformly over the leaf. So what you see here is an insecticide sprayed leaf. Now, surface tailoring is something which we call wettability engineering. What we do in surface tailoring is that suppose we have a metal surface and I don't want the waters to stick on it, we can do several tricks to essentially cover the material with a coating which gives us the desired wettability. For example, any material with a high surface energy, for example, a glass or a metal, which generally tends to be hydrophilic, we can coat on those materials like Teflon, fluorinated hydrocarbon, or other non-polar polymers to give them a hydrophobic nature. And these coatings can be rendered through different processes. For example, coating, plasma deposition, vapor deposition, micro-nano texturing. One such example Steffen highlighted in his lectures, sputtering, etc. And depending upon the texture, you basically need both texture and surface energy to render get a desired extent of wettability. And you can get Cassie-Baxter state or Wenzel state, and it all depends upon the structuring that you get. You can get hydrophilic surface. Some materials are intrinsically hydrophilic, which has high surface energy. And if you render the surface rough, high energy surface rough, it becomes super hydrophilic. Again, there are methods of making that or generating this surface roughness, starting from chemical etching to micropatterning, sputtering. And the telltale sign of surface being super hydrophilic, that whenever you dispense a liquid, it spreads almost instantly. So again, coming back to this point of care diagnostic device for SARS-CoV-2, we needed a device that ensures, a POC device that ensures faster transport, allows multiplexing, enables liquid metering on chip, and merging and mixing. Too many things, but let's see if we can get there. The problem, again, as I mentioned, with these capillary-driven devices is that they are intrinsically slow. The transport of liquid, not only in the lateral flow immunoassay that I showed, but in many other types of lateral flow devices, that they are inherently limited by the slow movement of the liquid. And this slow movement is actually prescribed by this American chemist E.W. Washburn, who suggested that this propagation velocity of the liquid front scales inversely with the distance of propagations, which means if a liquid starts spreading, the larger it spreads, slower it becomes. And that kind of seals the fate of diapers also, let alone the POC devices. So our first target was, can we surpass this Washburn limit of velocity? To do that, what we did was something similar to what Steffen showed to you a few minutes ago. They developed a conical structure of hydrophobic surface. What we did was we developed a conical structure of, it's a flat structure, it's not a structure, a wettability pattern. We got the wettability pattern through different methods, but to cut the long story short, we have a super hydrophobic surface, and on that super hydrophobic surface, we were able to etch or deposit super hydrophilic tracks that has tapering structure, that is narrow at one end and wider at the other end, something similar to that. And we have one such plate in front of you where we have these tracks. It's a horizontal plate, and this brighter or white part is the super hydrophobic area where you can see several droplets are sitting, light droplets sitting on a lotus leaf. At the moment we push a gentle, and these tracks, or diverging tracks, are super hydrophilic. And you can see vaguely some water already sticking, pre-suffused on this track because they were hydrophilic, and from prior experiments they already had water. And when we put a gentle tap on this plate, we found that, the droplets disappeared almost instantly. To see what actually happened in a more convincing manner, we slowed the video by 250 times and then realized that as we put a gentle tap on the plate, because of the inertia, the droplets actually slid over the substrate, and they eventually touch the tracks, which are super hydrophilic. And along the direction of the super hydrophilic tracks, they are horizontal. All the droplets, they moved from the narrower end to the wider end. The pumping, it's a horizontal plate. The pumping that we saw, it was so pronounced that none of the droplets could escape the tracks. How did it happen? Well, just to get to that, let me quickly tell you that we had alternating hydrophobic and hydrophilic patches, and it was a paper in Science which showed us that, like, if you have a scenario where you have alternate patches of hydrophobic and hydrophilic, or super hydrophobic and super hydrophilic patches, and you like feed water to the hydrophilic tracks, you get to see ridges of liquid. But if you increase the volume a little bit, at locations you get to see some, because of some instability, you get to see bulges of liquid. Now, what we have in our case was, like, whenever we deposited sufficient amount of water on the narrow end of the track, it created a bulge. The droplets which jumped on the track, they had a momentary bulge. And this momentary bulge looked like this. And as the bulge was formed here, it experienced a force in the downstream direction as the track widened. How? Well, I mean, it's because of the Laplace pressure gradient, or you can say that the force at the contact point gives rise a net forward moving force. Roughly, you can say that the radius of curvature on the narrower side being smaller than the radius of curvature of the liquid on the larger side, it gets a net pressure gradient which moves the liquid droplet in the forward direction. And that's what you get under this is a slow moving, it's played at 1/30th speed. So this is how you see the droplet moving. Question is, do we exceed the Washburn rate? Yes, when we did the measurement, we calculated the Washburn limit of flow rate depending upon the pore size, or rather the surface texture morphology of that plate, and we still found that the liquid droplet actually overcame the Washburn rate, which was shown by this dotted line. Of course, the rate of this, or the speed of this travel depending upon the roughness features, but that's a more detailed story. I'm not going to discuss dwell on that today. Now, when we had this fast moving, then we focused whether we can do a metering on that. What you see here is a pair of those diverging tracks and a third track on the end of that. And when you deposit these pairs of droplets, we saw that depending upon the design, we get n number of droplets being collected. They are transporting because of this forward capillary force that you saw in our previous slides. And they're merging together after a precise dispensing of liquids and collecting at a downstream location. There is hardly any backflow. There is mixing or merging of the liquids, and downstream location you can expect to be having good mixing. Under high-speed imaging, this is what actually happens. The liquids which are coming from the top side being fed, they coalesce, and because of the inertial sloshing, they jump to the third superhydrophilic track. So the black is superhydrophobic and the white part is superhydrophilic. So from the superhydrophobic track, the liquid goes to the superhydrophilic region. And if you see it from the end, you can clearly see that there is quite a good amount of droplet inertia influencing this process, which also gives us an opportunity to have a good mixing. Otherwise, in a small length scale, mixing is something hard to come by. People working in the area of microfluidics are well aware of that. So we decided to go for a little bit of improvement in the track design, and went for making a capillary driven Funny thing is that the reverse will not be true, meaning that if you just flip the surface, making that you deposit a liquid on the top superhydrophilic surface and the other side is superhydrophobic, there will be no penetration. And this is known as the liquid diode. And we tried to leverage this principle of liquid diode to make a face mask. We initiated the process during the lockdown when there was no mask in the market. So we decided whether we can use our household materials like polypropylene bags lying at the corners of our house and a cellulosic fiber, a cellulosic fabric like the ubiquitous gamcha or a t-shirt to make a 3-layered mask. What we intended to have is a hydrophobic layer, an inner intermediate layer which is hydrophilic, the cellulosic layer, and another layer which is hydrophobic. The principle of transport will be like this. If you have a droplet which is coming at a high velocity and is impacting on the inner hydrophobic polypropylene layer, so the mask wearer is on this side, and if he or she sneezes, the droplet at a high velocity will impinge on this hydrophobic side. And because of this impingement pressure plus the Laplace pressure, it will penetrate through this hydrophobic layer, and the intermediate hydrophilic layer will capture this, this liquid and it will spread. Further penetration of this liquid to the other side will not be possible because now we have a hydrophilic followed by a hydrophobic layer. So the water diode principle will resist a transport of the liquid from the outside to the inside. What happens to a liquid droplet floating outside? In that case, the impact velocity from outside may not be high enough for this outer layer to be penetrated and to go inside. So we did a back of the envelope calculation because the envelope is the only thing that we had at the time of lockdown. The images and everything that we see are taken in a household through a household kids experimental setup. We couldn't use our laboratory setups to measure the contact angles also. We calculated depending upon the pore diameter and found out that the liquid droplet would be able to penetrate these fibers if we have a droplet impacting with a velocity greater than like 0.7 meter per second, which is the case when you sneeze. But generally, if somebody is wearing a mask and is walking, he or she doesn't encounter from outside a droplet exceeding a velocity like this. So what you can get out of this 3-layered mask is that if the wearer sneezes or coughs, the droplets are arrested inside the mask, and the wearer is also protected from the outside droplet when he inhales. We also tested our mask, the DIY mask, against like a household spray test. And we figured out that yes, because of the spray, we used a color to check whether the inner cellulosic layer is getting, or the hydrophilic layer is getting the liquid. Yes, we saw that when we sprayed the liquid on the mask and we opened the outer layer, the intermediate layer was absorbing the liquid, and the penetration was 0 in our case. Like we put a shiny mirror on the other side of the mask and sprayed from a distance, and our mask didn't give any penetration. The mirror was dry, and we compared it with the surgical mask, which gave a penetration and the mirror was wet. This was a very crude experiment, but it still shows the efficacy. This mask was developed under the leadership of our cast of Jadavpur University, which is an innovation cell, and it's being marketed also by one company currently. There are a few other applications, and as I mentioned in the slide of Washburn law, I mentioned that he kind of sealed the fate of diapers. So there was another project which, in collaboration with, which took place in UIC, and I was a part of that collaborative work, where we tried to develop better diapers for Kimberly-Clark. And I cannot really show you the final design because of the IP issues, but what we did was we developed wettability patterning and I'll show you a movie. What we did was we wettability patterned the inner layer of the diaper, which is known as liner, and we tested that under a real life scenario, or rather a highly enhanced scenario of very strong jet flow. They call it insult. So for an insult flow rate of 1100 milliliter per minute and a duration of 2 seconds, a wettability pattern could confine the liquid sprayed, and it led to very good absorption. I think I have, sorry, am I still visible? Because my PowerPoint's just crashed. Okay, so I'm at almost at the end of my presentation. Something wrong happened, and just bear with me for a second. Yes, I think the movie kind of crashed the system. So how am I doing with time?
Yes, you have some more time.
Okay, I have like it's trying to revive. It's not closing for some reason. Let me see. Here's the application. Okay, and I think the presentation is gone now.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is.
Okay. So
you can come back to the presentation once more.
yes. So the other work, you can see me, right?
Yes.
The other work we did was we tried to see if we can change the wettability of surface and like a glass surface, and we can use them for coating of the covers, glass covers on solar photovoltaic cells. As we know that dust is a big problem, a menace in in solar photovoltaic cells. So in order to coat the glass, we used a chemical sol gel deposition technique where we tried to retain the transmissivity of the glass, as well as we tried to make them super hydrophobic. So the glass surface was super hydrophobic, and as you can see that when the glass surface was super hydrophobic under impact of minimal water, the liquid we were able to have self-cleaning behavior or render a surface self-cleaning. What it did was that we saw that a super hydrophobic surface was able to pick up the dust from the surface, and as it rolled down the surface, it picked up the dust and rendered the surface clean. It was pretty well visible or quantified when we compared the surface with a regular glass surface. What we saw is that with the deposition of the coating, the initial transmissivity suffered like 4% drop, but with the dust being deposited, and after that, when you clean the surface with small amount of transmissivity of the coated glass surface was more than the uncoated surface. So there were like about 25% improvement in the transmissivity recovery upon cleaning when we had self-cleaning SPV cell covers. There are several this wettability patterning using this to enhance dropwise condensation on a surface. So this is analogous to what Steffen showed to you. Like he showed on a 3D structure, they were able to repel the droplets and they were coming out of the structure. Here what we did was we were able to remove the droplets, condensate droplets regularly using these planar wettability patterns. Or we could even like guide to follow which could be used for cooling electronic devices. local hotspot. The applications, the areas are multiple, and I mean we are working on. I'd like to thank my team, which comprises at JU, comprises of Professor Amitabh Datta in my department, Professor Debojyoti Ghoshal, who was involved in this solar photovoltaic cell coating, and the entire JU cast team for the mask, and my students. And of course, for a large part of the work that I showed, it ensued my collaboration with University of Illinois Chicago, Professor Konstantin Negrides and his team. I'd like to thank them as well. And finally, I'd like to thank you all for participating in this.
So, thank you, Ranjan, for this excellent lecture. There are a couple of questions for Steffen. I will first go to him. One question is from Ranjan and one from Shyam. I may ask Ranjan to ask the question himself. So, Ranjan, if you...
Yeah, so, yeah, my question was like, when you have this, for example, in your slide, and you don't need to pull up the slide, you showed that the condensate droplets were jumping out of these conical pillars. Okay, now, yes. if you, I mean, was that plate vertically held or horizontally? What I'm trying to say is that if the droplets go up, or rather, if they are rejected from the surface and they fall back on the surface again, if it's horizontal, then there is a problem. So, was it a vertically held?
Yes. I'm not totally sure about that, but as far as I can see, this was a vertical orientation of the surface.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So the other question is from Shyam, Dr. Shyam Sengupta to Steffen. Shyam, will you continue with your question?
Yeah, sure. So, Steffen, I was asking about this hierarchical structures which you have made. With nanoparticles, you put these pillared hierarchical structures, which where we're applying the voltage. So, yes. what kind of seeing and how are you fabricating this sort of structures?
This is actually a very easy process. These are polystyrene particles. Okay. So, I mean, I'm not a chemist, but the way how you actually fabricate these particles, I mean, this is documented. So we are not, I mean, we haven't invented that. So we basically utilize this polystyrene nanoparticles, but then basically the very simple way of preparing your surfaces is you just take a suspension of these particles and brush them on the surfaces. So basically the surfaces I showed were obtained by brushing. So you have to be careful with brushing, but brushing is a very simple way of giving you these hierarchical surfaces.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So I have a small question to Steffen. You have shown the effect of surface tension in case of flow of two liquids through a narrow capillary tube using wine and water. Now, people are now using emulsified fuel with water, with diesel, and when that such emulsified fuel flows through fuel injectors, which are also very small, do you think that there can be some effect of surface tension force, which can facilitate the atomization as well?
So emulsified fuel, you mean it's a water in oil emulsion? Yes. Or
yes, water in oil?
It's a water in oil emulsion. So I would guess, I mean, I'm not totally sure about the actual setup of that, but I would guess that's a different scenario because what we really need, we need a gas-liquid interface. Mm-hmm. And if you have this, I mean, I don't see where for this emulsified fuel you get the gas-liquid interface.
No, there is a interface between solid and liquid. Only with the surface of the.
Yeah. Basically, you need evaporation. You need phase change for that, because phase change basically gives you the enrichment of water, and enrichment of water gives you the Marangoni pulling force. I mean, force pulling these liquid rings. And if you don't have that, then I think it's a different scenario.
Okay. Then there was a question from Professor Pulak Sengupta, but he also got the answer eventually.
No, just one clarification. No, Ranjan.
Yes.
Amitabh, just allow me.
Yes. Yes, please.
When I was writing regarding this 3-layer mask, and within few seconds you possibility. I just want to add one thing, that in your experiment, you held this layer structure as static bodies.
Yes.
Actually, when the masks are on, and in fact, that is a problem. I mean, many people are obvious to know. When I put this is a very simple physics, that I create a suction effect. Inside, there is an experiment that can overpower that held the water drop, and then it's dangerous because it will just get it.
Yeah, just to answer your question, the droplet that gets stuck on the outer hydrophobic layer, it doesn't get inside because of the suction, because otherwise you have to really suck really very hard. Generally, what's happening, even people wearing N95 and despite getting infected, it's happening because of the inhalation between the skin and the mask. I have seen doctors wearing masks which were like, I mean, they were like millimeters of gaps between, I mean, in the nose bridge. A surgical tape to seal the gap between. So that's probably the reason. There is another very important thing, like what sort of mask we should wear. Is that like, if your mask is, for example, it's an N95 mask, and when you inhale, there is a larger pressure drop. As there is a larger pressure drop, there is a higher chance of in-leakage to the gaps if you are not wearing it properly. On the other hand, if mask is not so much, yes, the pores are larger and you have a higher probability of finer droplets getting inside the mask. It can happen that the droplet size is so small that directly inside. That's a low probability, but at the same time, it reduces the chance of air from the sides. So sometimes wearing an N95 mask in an experimental than wearing a cloth mask in